All right. So in this session, I wanted to quickly go over permission testing. So in AWS, all the permissions are determined based on IAM policy documents. So IAM stands for Identity Access Management. And so in a policy document, let's just open one of these policy documents. A policy document has any number of statements. So a statement consists of an action. So an action is kind of like a command. So here, let's say EC2. So the EC2 service, describe account attributes. That's the command. So that's like an API command. And this statement is saying that this specific action or these actions are allowed on any resource. So resource, and there's an asterisk here. So that's just saying that this policy document includes a statement which provides all these commands, and you can run any of these commands on any AWS resources. Okay, so why are we talking about permissions? So in our setup right now, we have multiple AWS accounts, right? So we have our production AWS accounts where Redshift sits and a lot of our other production services sit. Then we have staging. So a staging environment is just before production, and then we have our development account. So our development account is our sandboxed environment where we go and experiment and try and develop new solutions, right? Now, there's that separation between development, staging, and production. And what we set up was a cross-account deployment pattern where we can build our solutions in development, but we have the permission to actually deploy our solution into staging and production when it meets all the requirements and pass any test cases that we build. Okay. So the way that we got this permission is because we had agreement with infrastructure engineering saying that we are going to only deploy our resources that meet specific naming standards or tagging requirements, right? And these are certain requirements for certain services. Okay. So the way that we did this is by setting up permission boundaries. And permission boundaries are simply sets of AWS statements which define what types of actions and commands analytics is allowed to do in production. So to keep it simple, let's say we want to create an S3 bucket. We're allowed to create and delete and read from S3 buckets that might have a prefix of analytics in the front of that name. Anything else, we're not allowed to access or delete, right? So that minimizes our risk to other production systems and other resources. Okay, so I largely wrote out a lot of the permission boundaries, but each time we start to need more services or need to expand our access, let's say we want to start to use SageMaker or we want to use some of the other ML services, then we need to add more permissions to allow us to use those services in production. So we're basically expanding our permissions access. So one of the problem is, even though I'm writing all of these permissions out, I don't really know whether or not 100% sure that this is going to work as I design it. Like I write it out and I guess I hope for the best. If something breaks or doesn't work, then obviously it doesn't work. So one of the ways that you can do it is running the Iam Policy Simulator. So this policy simulator is a web-based tool. So here you go to policysim.awsamazon.com. And what this does, it hooks into your current AWS session, which is linking into your AWS account. And then you can simply go through each of the users that are in your account or groups or roles. And you can select those roles, and then you can go through the different services available in AWS, and then you can select different actions that you want to test. And then you can just run a simulation to see whether or not it's allowed or denied. And in this instance, this API gateway invalidate cache is denied based on this role. Quite simple, right? And you can actually do this for any number of roles and actions that you want to test out. Okay, but this is good for maybe ad hoc discovery and debugging, but it doesn't work so well for repeatability. So what I want is when I'm writing out my permission boundaries in CloudFormation, I want to make sure that what I'm writing out works, and also if I'm slightly modifying some existing permissions, am I making sure that I'm not removing any access accidentally? Okay, so this is where, before we get to this, then I came across this little package. So this is AWS-Iam Tester. So this is a little command line tool which helps you run the policy simulator, basically. So what it does, it's a command line tool that allows you to feed in, I guess, tests. So if you think of the API gateway invalidate cache is a single test, I could create a number of different test scenarios and set them up and then pass them into this package. And this package will then act as a proxy and pass them into the Iam policy simulator. Okay, so you can do things like this. You can, in this specific example, this is using the program, and it's doing a search to see which other roles in the current AWS account have access to S3 put object. So this is just one example of what it's doing. And you can see it lists out all the different roles. So this is not exactly what I'm using it for. I'm using it for this bit. So what I'm doing is I'm actually feeding it in a whole bunch of these, I guess, test cases. So what I'm doing when I'm building my permission boundaries, I'm building the permission boundaries as another package or solution in itself, right? And in this solution itself, I'm attaching a whole bunch of test cases. I want to make sure that this solution is still working as I designed it, right? So normally you have like unit tests and integration tests. Well, in this example, for my permission boundaries, I'm creating a whole bunch of permission tests. So this is one permission test, see? So it lists out actions. So the types of actions that you want to test. So these are the different types of actions that you want to test. Then expected result. So you can either say, I expect this test case to either fail or succeed. Then you can list out the resources, and then you can limit it to certain roles or users. And then you can also add context. So here it's just saying, is the multi-factor authentication present or not? Now this would be applicable when we want to check for tags. Okay, so what we've got now is we want to build out permission boundaries or permissions, a set of policy documents, right? Then we're building that into a solution, and then that's going to be in a coded solution in CloudFormation. And then we want to test all of these things. Now we can test these things with the Iam Policy Simulator, but we want a more repeatable process. So some way that we can set up in our repository that we can set up all our test cases, but then it also hooks back into the API of the Iam Policy Simulator. And so that's where this package exists. It exists to facilitate access to the API. Okay. Now let's go over to the solution. So I've called this CDK boundary. It's for the permission boundaries. And when I look through my pipeline stack, I won't go into detail on how this is all working, but just note that in my pipeline stack, so remember when we're deploying into production, we go from code, which is in code commit, that gets picked up by code pipeline, that goes through a code build process. That code build process builds the CloudFormation template. CloudFormation will deploy the resources into the account. So in this case, we're deploying IAM roles. And then once that's done, then I'm running a last stage or last test stage. I've just called this integration test stage, which is simply running a shell script. And that shell script is simply running pytest test permission. Okay, so this is pointing to the test directory and then the permissions subdirectory. So here under my repository, so I've got tests, and here I've got permissions. And then what this is doing, pytest will scan through this folder and then pick up any Python scripts which have tests in their prefix. Once it does that, then it will scan through this whole code and then look for any functions that have a prefix of test. And again, it will just scan all the way down to here. So test help, test version, test runs. Could have named that better. So all this is doing is running the AWS Iam Tester, just making sure that the package does run. Then here's just making sure what version it's actually running. And then here it's just running the package again with the config file, and then it's pointing to the script path where it's this directory, and then it's finding the YAML. Then it's how many runs to run. So this is how many test cases, like maximum number of test cases that we can pass through, and I've just chosen 1,000 for the moment. Okay, so it's pointing to config no comments. So I've actually created two files here, one with comments and one without comments. So here we can see that we've got test cases listed out. Let me make that a bit bigger. So here it's just testing action, then all the different actions that I want to test. I think this should succeed. And these are the resources that I'm testing against. And this should succeed because it's got RACQ S3 for the dev account. It's got the account number and then the team name. And then this is just a bucket name that I've used. Now this one is actually a little bit different. CW is CloudWatch Synthetics. So this is actually for canary monitoring. But you can see we've got another test case down here, which is create and delete bucket. This one should fail. That's because I've got RACQ S3 fail. So that doesn't meet any of the name conventions that we have at the moment. Okay. So let me just go over to here. So these two files are actually the same. And all I've done in this file, the config.yaml, is just try and give some description of what this test case is actually trying to do. So when the naming standards meet, allow, create and delete buckets. Well, actually make sure that it allows a lot more than that. And so you can see that there's a lot of tests. We've got 859 lines of various test cases. And this is just making sure that each time I make a change to my policy document that I'm deploying, I'm going back, running all of these test cases, making sure that it doesn't break anything. Okay. So the way that this actually works is at the top here, global limit 2. So if this is not populated, what this will do by default is will run the policy simulator and all of these test cases against every single role and user in their account. But what we want to do is constrain it to a specific role. So here we're deploying the permission boundaries into production. And so we just want to test that our permission boundaries role or policy document is listed here. And then we want to run all of these tests against it. So I think yeah, so this bit. So at the very start of this test script, what it'll do, it will open up the config file. It will go and grab the deployment role and the execution role from the environment, and then populate that into the global limit 2 variable. And then once that's done, it will just output the complete file into the config no comments file, which is here. Now you won't actually see this because I haven't actually, when I ran this last time, I ran it locally and I don't have those variables populated. But when this runs in the code pipeline process at the very end, those two things, the deployment role and the permission boundaries policy, are available in the environment on the code build step, and those will get populated into here. Okay. And so, yeah, so just running through this, it helps make sure that you're not breaking something, and also helps you author new permissions. So you could add a new permission, but in the process, you want to make sure that when you're adding it, it will actually work. So before you might want to add a new test case here. This is the action that you want to allow. You should expect it to succeed, and then you list out the resource that you need it to run against. You do that. That's your new test case, making sure that it fails first, and then you go back to your solution, add the required permissions to your solution to make sure it works and passes. And once that's done, then obviously you can start to progress it to production. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover. Thanks.